Vacate the room, my father said the moment my brother and his wife stepped through the front door. The words landed harder than I expected, not because they were loud, but because of how easily he said them. As if I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. As if I hadn't spent years helping him after my mother passed away. As if the woman standing beside the fireplace wasn't his 68-year-old daughter. Nobody objected. Nobody even looked surprised. My brother David adjusted the cuff of his expensive jacket. His wife Rachel smiled politely and handed my father a bakery box tied with a silver ribbon. The living room smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls, and sunlight streamed through the large windows overlooking the backyard. It should have felt warm. Instead, it felt like there wasn't enough air in the room. I slowly set my coffee mug on the side table. The ceramic made a soft click against the wood. "Of course," I said. My father nodded without meeting my eyes. "We need some privacy." Privacy. That word stayed with me as I walked down the hallway. For years, I had driven 40 minutes every weekend to help him with groceries, doctor's appointments, and home repairs. For years, I had been trusted with everything from insurance paperwork to emergency contacts. Yet suddenly I was being asked to leave my own chair in his house because David and Rachel had arrived. I sat in the kitchen and stared through the window above the sink. The maple tree outside swayed gently in the spring breeze. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. But something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Then I heard another car pull into the driveway. Curious, I glanced through the side window. A dark sedan had parked behind David's SUV. A tall man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. Even from a distance, I recognized him. Michael Carter, my father's attorney. My stomach tightened. Nobody had mentioned a meeting. Nobody had mentioned legal paperwork. Through the narrow opening of the kitchen door, I watched Michael enter the living room. He shook hands with everyone and took a seat. For a moment, his eyes shifted toward the hallway. Toward me. His expression changed slightly. Not pity. Not surprise. More like concern. Then he opened his briefcase and removed a stack of documents. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Rachel leaning forward eagerly. I could see David smiling. I could see my father signing something. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. When it finally ended, Michael was the last person to leave. As he walked toward the front door, he glanced down the hallway once more. This time our eyes met directly. He paused, just for a second. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, removed a business card, and quietly placed it on the entryway table before leaving. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Just another lawyer finishing another meeting. I had no idea that before the month was over, that small white card would become the reason my entire family lost everything they thought they owned. That evening I drove home beneath a sky painted orange and gold by the setting sun, but I barely noticed the view. My mind kept returning to the image of Michael Carter placing that business card on the table. Something about it felt deliberate. Not dramatic. Not urgent. Just intentional. When I reached my small colonial house on the edge of town, I carried my purse inside and set it on the kitchen counter. The clock above the stove read 6:15. Normally, I would have started preparing dinner right away, but instead I sat at the table and stared out the window. Across the street, a young couple walked their dog. A delivery truck rolled slowly past. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something important had happened in my father's living room. The next morning, I followed my usual routine. I watered the flowers on the porch. I checked the mailbox. I stopped by the grocery store for milk, eggs, and fresh fruit. But every quiet moment brought me back to the same question. Why had Michael looked concerned? By noon I gave in and pulled the business card from my purse. The white cardstock was thick and expensive. His name was printed neatly beneath the logo of his law firm. On the back, written in blue ink, was a short message. Call me when you have time. No explanation. No details. Just one sentence. I turned the card over several times before setting it back down. Lawyers did not usually leave handwritten notes for people they barely knew, especially not attorneys who represented their clients carefully and professionally. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to ignore it. I organized old photo albums. I folded laundry. I cleaned out a kitchen drawer that had needed attention for months. Nothing helped. By evening, curiosity had become something heavier. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang unexpectedly. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Margaret. The voice was calm and familiar. It was Michael. I sat a little straighter. Yes. There was a brief pause on the line. I apologize for calling so late. I wanted to make sure you received my card. I glanced toward the kitchen counter. I did. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Careful. Measured. There is something I need to tell you, he said quietly. But before I do, I want you to promise me something. My heartbeat quickened. What is it? His answer came immediately. Do not sign any documents anyone places in front of you. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not until we speak in person. I felt a chill despite the warm spring air drifting through the open window. What kind of documents? I asked. But Michael did not answer directly. I cannot discuss everything over the phone. Not yet. I only wanted to make sure you heard this from me first. I gripped the edge of the table. Is this about my father? The silence that followed told me more than words could have. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded even more serious. Margaret, there are things happening that you do not know about. And if I am right, somebody is counting on you remaining exactly where they believe you are. And where is that? I asked. His answer came softly. Outside the room. I did not sleep much that night. After the call ended, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after midnight, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beyond my neighborhood. Michael's words repeated themselves in my mind. Somebody is counting on you remaining exactly where they believe you are. Outside the room. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual and made myself a cup of coffee. The house felt unusually quiet. Even the familiar routines seemed different now. Questions had a way of changing ordinary things. By 10 o'clock, I found myself driving toward my father's neighborhood. I told myself I was only stopping by to check on him. That was what I had always done. For years, I had been the daughter who remembered appointments, picked up prescriptions, and made sure the gutters were cleaned before winter. Yet as I turned onto his street, I realized I was looking at everything differently. My father's house stood exactly as it always had. The white shutters, the neatly trimmed hedges, the American flag hanging beside the porch. Nothing had changed, except perhaps my ability to ignore what had always been there. Growing up, David had been the center of every room. When he scored a touchdown in high school, my father framed the newspaper clipping. When he graduated college, there was a party with more than 50 guests. When he bought his first house, my father proudly showed photographs to anyone willing to look. I never resented David for it. At least not then. I simply accepted that he was the son my father understood best. The son who shared his interests. The son who received every benefit of the doubt. I was the reliable one. The quiet one. The daughter who handled responsibilities while everyone else received applause. As I parked across the street, another memory surfaced. 5 years earlier, after a minor surgery, my father had called David first when he needed help. David had been too busy. Rachel had plans. Their children had activities scheduled. Eventually, my father called me. I spent 6 weeks driving him to appointments 3 times a week. He thanked me kindly afterward. Then he told everyone David had been incredibly supportive during his recovery. That was how things worked in our family. Not through cruelty. Through omission. Through small adjustments to reality that always seemed to favor the same people. I remained in my car for several minutes before noticing movement near the house. David's black SUV was parked in the driveway. Rachel stepped onto the porch holding a folder beneath her arm. She looked around carefully before placing the folder inside her vehicle. Then she returned to the house. My attention sharpened immediately. A few moments later, David emerged carrying another stack of papers. He looked unusually pleased with himself. Whatever was happening inside that house, it was not a casual family visit anymore. As I watched them disappear through the front door, I suddenly understood something that should have been obvious much earlier. Rachel did not merely want access to my father's life. She wanted control over whatever came after it. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Michael's warning was not about a single document. It was about an entire plan already in motion. I did not get out of the car right away. Instead, I watched the house for another 15 minutes. During that time, Rachel came outside twice. The first time she carried a folder. The second time she carried a small lockbox that I had never seen before. Each trip looked purposeful, organized, practiced. Nothing about her behavior suggested uncertainty. Whatever she and David were doing, they believed they were close to the finish line. Eventually, I drove away and headed toward a small diner near the courthouse. Michael had asked me to meet him there later that afternoon. The diner had been serving the same menu for decades. Red vinyl booths, black and white tile floors, Coffee that somehow tasted exactly the same every year. I arrived early and chose a booth near the window. Rain clouds had begun gathering outside, casting long shadows across Main Street. At exactly 2 o'clock, Michael walked through the front door carrying his leather briefcase. He shook my hand and sat down across from me. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. A waitress poured coffee into our cups and left. Michael waited until she was gone before opening his briefcase. He removed several documents and placed them carefully on the table. I immediately recognized my father's signature. "Before we discuss these," he said quietly, "I need to ask you a question. Has your father been making unusual financial decisions lately?" I thought about it. Over the past year, he had sold a parcel of land he once insisted would stay in the family forever. He had closed an investment account. He had changed banks. At the time, he explained everything away as simplification, aging, convenience. Now those explanations sounded less convincing. Michael listened carefully as I described each change. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "That is what I was afraid of." My stomach tightened. "What exactly is happening?" Michael folded his hands. "Your father believes he is protecting his family." The way he emphasized the word family made my chest sink. "And he is not." Michael looked down at the documents. "The problem is that he has been receiving advice from people whose interests may not fully align with his own." He chose every word carefully, like a man stepping across thin ice. "David and Rachel?" I asked. He did not answer directly. Instead, he slid one document toward me. It was a property transfer form. Another document followed. Then another. I stared at the pages. Signatures, dates, asset schedules, legal language. Most of it was difficult to understand, but one detail stood out immediately. Rachel's name appeared again and again. Not as an owner. Not yet. But everywhere decisions were being discussed, her influence seemed present. Michael closed the folder and lowered his voice. "Margaret, there is one more thing you need to know." Outside, the first drops of rain struck the window. Cars moved slowly through the intersection. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. "Several weeks ago," he said, "a page disappeared from your father's estate file." I frowned. "A page?" He nodded. "And that missing page changes everything." For several seconds, I simply stared at him. A missing page sounded almost insignificant. One sheet of paper, one document among hundreds. Yet the expression on Michael's face told me otherwise. He reached into his briefcase and removed a photocopy. The page looked ordinary at first glance. Legal language, signatures, witness information, the kind of paperwork most people never read carefully. Michael placed his finger near the bottom section. "This is a duplicate that was archived separately years ago," he explained. "The original disappeared from the primary file." I leaned closer. Rain continued tapping against the diner window. The sound seemed louder now. "Why does this matter?" I asked. Michael took a slow breath. "Because this page contains a condition that affects ownership of every major asset in your father's estate." My eyes moved across the document again. The language was formal, but the meaning gradually became clear. Decades earlier, shortly after my parents purchased several properties, they had created a protective clause. Any beneficiary who attempted to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence estate decisions could lose inheritance rights entirely. The assets would then be redirected according to a secondary distribution plan. I looked up sharply. "You are saying somebody removed this page on purpose?" Michael did not answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands and glanced toward the rainy street outside. "I am saying that the page vanished shortly before several major changes were proposed. The distinction mattered. Lawyers rarely accused anyone directly, but I understood what he meant. My stomach tightened. Memories began rearranging themselves inside my mind. Rachel's sudden interest in financial discussions, David's confidence, the private meetings, the folders, the lockbox, even the way they behaved that day in my father's living room. It all felt different now, more deliberate. "Does my father know?" I asked quietly. Michael shook his head. "Not yet." That answer hurt more than I expected. Whatever mistakes my father had made, I did not believe he understood the full picture. He was 89 years old, proud, independent, determined to believe the best about his family, especially about David. Outside, a delivery truck splashed through a puddle as it passed the diner. The waitress refilled our coffee cups. Neither of us touched them. "There is something else," Michael said. He opened another folder and slid a spreadsheet toward me. Numbers filled the page. Transfers, withdrawals, property evaluations, financial projections. Most of it was beyond my expertise, but one detail stood out immediately. Several calculations assumed ownership changes that had not officially happened yet. Someone had already been planning for assets they did not legally control. I felt a chill spread through me. Not fear. Recognition. For the first time, I could see the shape of the entire strategy forming beneath the surface. They were not waiting to see what happened. They believed the outcome was already guaranteed. Michael carefully closed the folder. "Margaret," he said quietly, "if events continue the way they are moving now, your family is heading toward a legal disaster. The only question is whether anyone realizes it before it is too late." When I left the diner, the rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened beneath the gray afternoon sky. I drove home slowly, replaying every detail of my conversation with Michael. The missing page, the projected transfers, the assumption that certain assets would soon belong to different people. None of it felt accidental anymore. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. I was done dismissing my instincts. For too many years I had explained away uncomfortable truths because keeping peace felt easier than asking difficult questions. That evening, I opened an old cedar chest in my guest room. Inside were family records I had inherited after my mother's passing. Tax statements, property documents, letters, insurance policies, decades of carefully organized paperwork. My mother had saved everything. At the time, I thought it was excessive. Now I silently thanked her. For several hours, I sat on the floor surrounded by folders and envelopes. Most of the documents confirmed things I already knew. Then, just after 9 o'clock, I found something unexpected. It was a copy of an estate planning summary prepared nearly 20 years earlier. Across the top were both my parents' names. I carefully read every page. Several provisions had changed over the years, but one detail immediately caught my attention. My mother had insisted on protective safeguards regarding family assets. She believed wealth should support future generations, not create opportunities for manipulation. Her words were written plainly in a memorandum attached to the file. Reading them felt like hearing her voice again. Calm, practical, wise. The next morning, I received a call from my father. His tone sounded unusually cheerful. He invited me to a family gathering the following weekend. Apparently, David and Rachel were organizing a celebration. "Everyone will be there," he said proudly. "It is time we start thinking about the future." I agreed to attend. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Something about the timing felt important. A celebration, discussions about the future, property transfers already being anticipated. The pieces continued fitting together. 2 days later, Michael called again. His voice carried a level of urgency I had not heard before. "I need you to know something," he said. "Several additional documents were submitted this morning." My grip tightened around the phone. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that suggests somebody believes the estate plan is already settled." I walked to the kitchen window and stared outside. The neighborhood looked peaceful. Children rode bicycles down the street. A mail carrier crossed a lawn carrying packages. Ordinary life continued while a storm gathered beneath the surface of my family. "Can they do that?" I asked quietly. Michael paused. "They can try." The answer lingered with me long after the call ended. Because for the first time, I realized this was no longer about inheritance alone. It was about confidence. David and Rachel were acting like people who expected to win. They were making plans, preparing celebrations, rearranging their future around assets they believed would soon be theirs. What they did not know was that the missing page had already been found, and neither of them had any idea how much that discovery was about to cost them. The family gathering took place the following Saturday afternoon. The weather was perfect. Bright sunshine stretched across the neighborhood, and a gentle breeze moved through the trees surrounding my father's property. Cars filled the driveway and lined both sides of the street. From the outside, it looked like a celebration. Inside, it felt more like a performance. Rachel greeted guests near the front door with effortless confidence. She moved through the house as though she already owned it. David stood beside my father, laughing easily, accepting congratulations that seemed to arrive before any official announcement had even been made. I noticed that immediately. People were speaking as though certain decisions had already been finalized, as though the future had already been assigned and distributed. I arrived carrying a small pie from a local bakery. Nothing extravagant, just something polite to bring. Rachel accepted it with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret, you made it," she said. "Of course," I replied. "Family gatherings are important." For a brief moment, neither of us looked away. Then she turned toward another guest. I spent most of the afternoon observing. Years earlier, I would have tried to make conversation, refill drinks, help in the kitchen, and smooth over awkward moments. This time I simply watched. David seemed unusually relaxed, more relaxed than I had seen him in years. Several times I overheard him discussing renovation ideas, expanded living spaces, new landscaping, updated flooring. Each conversation centered on plans for properties that technically did not belong to him. Yet he spoke as though ownership was merely a formality waiting to be completed. My father appeared pleased by all of it. He sat in his favorite chair near the fireplace while guests came and went. Every compliment directed toward David seemed to brighten his mood. It reminded me of countless moments throughout our lives. My father had always loved certainty, and David gave him certainty, confidence, assurance. Whether that confidence was justified rarely seemed to matter. As the afternoon continued, I noticed something else. Rachel kept disappearing into my father's office. Not for long periods, just a few minutes at a time. Long enough to retrieve something. Long enough to check something. Long enough to make me curious. Near sunset, while guests gathered on the patio, she slipped inside once again. This time, when she emerged, she was carrying a familiar folder. Dark blue, thick, carefully organized. The same type of folder Michael had shown me days earlier. She quickly placed it inside a leather tote bag and returned to the party. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Across the yard, David raised a glass and thanked everyone for coming. His speech sounded almost rehearsed. He spoke about family legacy, future generations, exciting opportunities ahead. Guests applauded warmly. My father smiled with visible pride. Rachel stood beside David with her hand resting lightly on his arm. They looked like people celebrating a victory, and perhaps they believed they were. But as I watched them standing together beneath the golden evening sky, I remembered Michael's warning. The missing page had already changed everything. The only people who did not know it yet were the ones making plans for a future that no longer existed. 3 days after the gathering, Michael called and asked me to meet him at his office. The urgency in his voice left little room for interpretation. When I arrived, he escorted me into a conference room overlooking downtown. The long oak table was covered with neatly organized folders. Every chair was empty except for ours. Michael closed the door behind him and placed a thick file in front of me. "It is time," he said quietly. I sat down and opened the folder. Inside were copies of documents I had never seen before. Property transfer requests, financial projections, draft agreements. Some had been completed. Others were waiting for signatures. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. David and Rachel had already begun arranging their future around assets they expected to receive. There were discussions about refinancing properties, notes about renovation budgets, even preliminary conversations with contractors. They had moved far beyond hope. They were operating from certainty. Michael slid another document toward me. This one looked different. It carried official certifications and archival references. "This is the recovered page," he said. I studied the familiar language again. The protective clause remained exactly as it had been written years earlier. Clear, direct, enforceable. Anyone attempting to improperly influence estate decisions could forfeit benefits connected to the estate. The secondary distribution provisions would immediately take effect. My pulse quickened. "Has anyone else seen this?" I asked. Michael nodded. "The court will." Outside the conference room window, clouds drifted across the afternoon sky. Traffic moved steadily below. Everything appeared normal. Yet I knew a storm was approaching. Michael opened another folder. This time he revealed correspondence, meeting records, and timelines. One detail stood out immediately. The missing page had disappeared shortly before several aggressive estate modifications were proposed. The sequence was impossible to ignore. Nobody needed dramatic accusations. The timeline spoke for itself. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the documents. For years I had watched people underestimate consequences. They assumed good intentions would protect them. They assumed rules applied to everyone except themselves. Now those assumptions were about to be tested. "What happens next?" I asked. Michael closed the file carefully. "Your father requested a formal family meeting next week." I remembered the confidence at the gathering. the speeches, the plans, the certainty, and they still believe everything is proceeding normally? Michael's expression remained calm. As far as I can tell, yes. A strange silence settled over the room. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just clarity. For the first time since all of this began, I could see the ending approaching. David and Rachel thought they were walking toward a celebration. My father believed he was securing his family's future. But hidden inside a single recovered page was a truth powerful enough to unravel every plan they had spent months building. And in less than a week, everyone would finally learn what had been waiting in the file all along. The family meeting took place the following Thursday afternoon in the same living room where I had once been asked to leave. The house looked exactly as it had that day. The same furniture, the same framed photographs, the same sunlight filtering through the windows. Yet everything felt different. Michael arrived carrying several folders and a leather briefcase. My father sat near the fireplace. David and Rachel occupied the sofa together. Their confidence was impossible to miss. They exchanged quiet smiles and whispered comments while waiting for the meeting to begin. They looked like people expecting confirmation rather than discussion. Once everyone was seated, Michael opened his briefcase and placed several documents on the coffee table. The room gradually grew quiet. My father thanked everyone for coming and explained that he wanted complete clarity regarding his estate plans. David nodded eagerly. Rachel folded her hands neatly in her lap. Michael listened without interruption. Then he began reviewing the file. At first, everything sounded routine. Property records, trust documents, financial summaries. My father appeared relaxed. David seemed pleased. Rachel remained calm. Then Michael reached the recovered page. The atmosphere changed immediately. He explained the protective clause carefully and read the language exactly as it had been written years earlier. Nobody interrupted. Nobody smiled. As he continued, he presented the timeline showing when the page disappeared and when certain estate modifications were proposed. He reviewed the supporting records one by one. The room became very still. My father leaned forward in his chair. David's expression slowly tightened. Rachel stopped taking notes. For the first time all afternoon, nobody seemed certain about what would happen next. Michael then explained the legal consequences triggered by the protective provision. Because the clause remained valid and enforceable, several proposed distributions could not proceed as planned. The secondary provisions would control the future disposition of major assets. Years of assumptions vanished in a matter of minutes. My father stared at the documents in front of him. Confusion gave way to realization. Then realization gave way to disappointment. Not anger, not outrage. Disappointment. The kind that settles quietly into a room and changes everything. David attempted to argue that there had been a misunderstanding. Rachel insisted they had only been trying to help organize the future. Michael listened respectfully and referred back to the documented timeline. The records spoke for themselves. Nobody needed to raise a voice. By the end of the meeting, the plans David and Rachel had built their future around no longer existed. Several anticipated property transfers became impossible. Financing arrangements tied to those expectations collapsed. Projects they had already discussed could not move forward. The certainty that had surrounded them for months disappeared completely. After the meeting ended, people left quietly. No dramatic speeches. No final confrontations. Just silence. I remained for a few minutes with my father. He looked older than he had a week earlier. We sat together without speaking. Eventually he glanced toward me and said, "I should have paid more attention." I nodded gently. There was nothing else to say. As I drove home that evening, the sun was setting beyond the hills. For the first time in months, my mind felt calm. Nobody had won. Nobody had lost because of revenge. The truth had simply arrived. And sometimes the hardest lesson a family can learn is that a house can be replaced, money can be earned again, but trust, once traded for greed, leaves behind an emptiness no inheritance can ever fill.